Oh, man.
Radio Free Innsmouth, episode 303, covering the True Kings of Norway. Specifically, the True Kings of Norway compilation re-released in the year 2000 by Spike Farm Records out of Finland that collects early material released between 1991 and 1994 by 5 different black metal bands.
5 of them!
From Norway. Now, I know for some reason, honestly going back about 10 years now, the hip thing to do is to be into black metal and talk about how all the Norwegian bands are overrated and they're not good. To that I say,
What's wrong with you?
knock that off. You're being silly. There is such a thing as an overcorrection. Because, yeah, I like the Hellenic black metal stuff, too. Yeah, I think a lot of the Slavic stuff is very underrated, but
Come on now.
there's a reason that the term true Norwegian black metal was such a big deal back in the day. It's because that stuff was revolutionary, and most, if not all, of the classic releases from that era still hold up today, and honestly kind of kill off most of the black metal that came out after them. It sends modern black metal home on a stretcher. And this particular compilation does a pretty good job of demonstrating why that is. It's a whole bunch of 7-inches from the early period of Norwegian black metal from a whole lot of classic bands, slapped together on one CD, and it includes a pretty cool fold-out chart showing how all these bands are connected to each other. Got to list all the members that play in each other's bands and all that. Got some dank pictures from back in the day of what they all looked like, what the 7-inches looked like. It's a valuable resource. Honestly, there's a decent chance that you probably already own this if you got into black metal as a teenager, because it's all over the place and you can get it for like friggin' $5 on Discogs. And until relatively recently, it was kind of the easiest way to hear a lot of these early black metal 7-inches. First band on the comp is Emperor with their 1994 single As the Shadows Rise. Now, Emperor is kind of an interesting band because, especially back when I was getting into black metal, this was always seen as like the beginner's black metal band. Like this was the first one you listened to, which in retrospect I actually find kind of odd because they have an uncharacteristically dense sound for the time period, mostly due to what I would call their bifurcated guitars. Like right here, that real buzzy guitar is the rhythm guitarist Samoth, but then comes in this smoother guitar sound that kind of blends more into the keyboards. That's being played by Isan, who is also providing vocals. And let me just say, this is the best Isan ever sounded, this and In the Nightside Eclipse. But yeah, they're like a 2-guitarist band, but they don't do conventional harmonies at all. It really is like 2 different melodic layers that kind of fight against each other, which also represents Emperor's influences in microcosm, in that Samoth is a very death metal, brutality-oriented kind of guy, which you can see after Emperor broke up, he started that Morbid Angel clone Cyclone, whereas Isan was always really big on prog rock and melodic metal. You'd think these 2 influences would be at odds with each other, but in the case of the best of Emperor, they actually work to balance each other out, and I vastly prefer Emperor to either member's more solo-oriented endeavors. The reason I think it's funny that they're sort of seen as this beginner's black metal band is if you actually get that first Emperor album everybody tells you to get, In the Nightside Eclipse, combining those 2 contrasting elements with the downright excessive level of reverb on that album's production means that for the inexperienced listener, it's going to be pretty much incomprehensible. I remember getting that album back in the day from friggin' Best Buy, and I was like, well, I like the cover, it sounds cool, but I can't tell what the hell's going on.
Huh?
I mean, nowadays, I think that album sounds amazing, but, when I was like a little kid in the early 2000s, it was pretty hard to make heads or tails of it outside of a few isolated melodic moments, like the big riff on I Am the Black Wizards, or that chunky part in Beyond the Great Vast Forest that goes like... That's where the As the Shadows Rise 7-inch comes in, because it's very similar in musical approach to In the Nightside Eclipse, but the production job on it isn't nearly as over the top. So for a beginning listener, it's honestly a lot easier to tell what the heck's going on, which is good because Emperor's music gets really strange at times. Second song on this particular 7-inch, Witch's Sabbath, has one of the weirdest moments in old school Emperor after that intense intro, when it jumps into this atmospheric portion with some, might I add, excellent drumming from Faust. But when that guitar really kicks in, it turns into the closest thing Emperor ever did to a band like Thorns, where you have these really declarative bar chords kind of hanging over the entire mix, and then Ihsahn's lead guitar doing this weird sort of dancing inside dissonant chords. Much darker and harsher than what's usually associated with Emperor. Then yeah, after that it does jump back into the fast-blasting, pompous, melodic, symphonic black metal that we all love Emperor for. But for that sort of singular moment, that's a pretty unique bit of music in Emperor's discography, and you can only hear it on the As the Shadows Rise EP. Another cool thing that Emperor does on the 7-inch is kind of harken back to their death metal roots. Because if you were unaware, much like almost every other Norwegian black metal band, Emperor started out kind of as a death metal band. In this case, they were called Thou Shalt Suffer. During their slower moments, they kind of sounded like Autopsy if you added keyboards, and then when it speeds up, it gets more morbid, angel-y, and chaotic. Darkthrone very early death metal demos also seem to be something of an aesthetic touching point here as well. Out of all these sort of proto-Norwegian black metal death metal bands, Thou Shalt Suffer might be my favorite. I even like them more than Old Funeral.
Take care, Arbiter. What you say is heresy.
But as far as reintroducing that sort of death metal sound to the As the Shadows Rise EP, Emperor redid probably the most simplistic song they ever wrote, Lord of the Storms, and almost sort of like a weird thrashy gore grind style.
나랑 서비스를
Right? Those fucking vocals.
What the hell's all this shit?
Yeah, you probably never thought you'd get to hear Ihsahn do some lymphatic phlegm style pitch-shifted gore grind vocals, but it happened. And it only ever happened on the As the Shadows Rise EP, which makes up the first 3 tracks of the True Kings of Norway split. Speaking of black metal bands that started out as death metal bands, Immortal, the coldest and most wintry of the original Norwegian black metal cadre, started out even more death metal sounding than Emperor, which might shock some people, but remember, Abbott was big into stuff like old school grindcore at one point.
Stuff from Repulsion.
I didn't even see him. I love Repulsion.
Oh yeah, fucking Black Breath, yeah.
And he even played in a death metal band with Varg Vikernes of all people called Old Funeral. The Old Funeral style kind of carried over into the first Immortal demo, which was unmistakably death metal sounding. My personal favorite song on that demo is entitled Enslaved to Rot, which is actually where the band Enslaved got their name from. They used to be a death metal band called Phobia. And it's some real nasty, groove-oriented, almost kind of New York death metal sounding stuff. I mean, check out these vocals from Abbott. Who knew he sounded like Frank Mullen back in the day? I've seen a lot of bootlegs of this demo calling it the Northern Unpin's Death. That's actually the name of the drawing Dead from Mayhem did for it, and it's actually called the Northern Upir's Death, Upir being an old Slavic term that eventually turned into our modern word vampire.
This shit ain't nothing to me, you stupid piece of shit. Step the wrong way and you will perish.
But despite the fact that it's clearly death metal, you can still hear a lot of the root of early Immortal's sound with the way these riffs don't necessarily grind so much as they shamble. Truly disgusting stuff. Highly recommended for fans of Autopsy. Here's my favorite riff of the demo.
제가 V앱을 너무 안 한다고
What do you mean that sounds familiar to you?
오빠가 그거를 해주면 이게 하드렌즈니까
Now see, that was a pretty darn good catch because they did in fact utilize that same riff on their first album a year later after the stylistic switch to black metal. But we don't even need to go that far into the future to hear that thanks to the True Kings of Norway compilation. Because what started out as Enslaved to Rot on their first demo and later on turned into the Cold Winds of Funeral Dust on their first album was also released on the self-titled 1991 7-inch single where it was called The Cold Winds of Funeral Frost. And this is a really interesting stylistic era for Immortal. Because whilst both songs on this 7-inch later on appeared on their first album, in this early form, they were still utilizing the down-tuned death metal guitars, which gives everything a much grimier sound that, honestly, I kind of prefer to the production job on their first album in some aspects. It also helps that these are probably the 2 most death metal sounding songs from that first album. It still has that weird lurching quality that was present on their first death metal demo. Just given more of a frostbitten black metal makeover. Even Abbott's vocals are a lot more death metal in sound. And if you're one of those weirdos like me, where Diabolical Full Moon Mysticism might be your favorite Immortal album, you really owe it to yourself to check out this early version of Immortal, available on the True Kings of Norway comp. And there's that riff from their pure death metal era making its reappearance in a more black metal form, which honestly works because it's a little bit less death metal and a little bit more thrash sounding. And the counterpoint follow-up riff to it is also awesome, as is Armageddon's drumming. Check out this roll. Listen, I pretty much loved everything Immortal recorded prior to their first breakup after Sons of Northern Darkness, but this early stuff is real special. Like, check out this more blasting style outro. I almost feel like they put in this little coda riff section there just for the sake of sounding black metal. But I'm not complaining because it sounds harsh and dark as fuck. Incredibly well done song, one of my favorite Immortal songs, and hearing it in this early version, thanks to the True Kings of Norway split, is a real treat. Third band on the split, probably the most controversial inclusion, if we're talking about the True Kangs of Norwegian black metal. Fucking Silly Nas and the Shagrats. Good old Demon Burger. Dummy Booger. You know them, you probably hate them. It's Dimmu Borgir, who I maintain were, at least on their first couple albums, actually a really sick band. Their contribution to this split comp, 1994's In Evigheten's Mørke, is kind of a weird one, because the title track is split into part 1 and part 2. Part 1's 5 minutes long, and it's all instrumental. It's got a part that goes like... sounding a whole lot like a riff you might hear on Dawn Slaughter's Son album, and eventually it morphs into stuff that sounds more like... something you would expect to hear more so from the band that comes after them on this split. We'll get to that. But mostly all that first part of the song does is it's just an intro. Not that much happens. Yeah, it's 5 minutes long. Part 2 is like the actual meat of the song. It's only 2 minutes.
What the fuck were they thinking?
Yeah, I don't really understand that construction at all, but at least when the song finally stops dragging its ass around, it hits you with some pretty quality Dimmu Borgir riffage. Yeah, it's got some pretty classic sort of melodic black metal riffs. Nothing too crazy, but they get the job done until the keyboards show up. At which point the music gets a whole lot more interesting, particularly the drumming, which is done by Shagrad, who kind of keeps switching between this sort of black metal polka beat and a more rolling, fill-heavy style, somewhat Graveland-esque, but then it happens.
Ah, jeez, dude.
The fucking worst synth patch ever that for some reason quite a few Norwegian bands felt the need to use way back in their very early days. Enslaved was big on it, and surprisingly enough, even Fenris from Darkthrone utilized it on the first Isengard album, although he was very apologetic about it in later years.
It's a horrible effect and shouldn't have been used by me or them. Probably.
What saves this particular 7-inch from becoming some sort of inconsequential juvenilia would have to be the third song, Rovbjorn Speiler Drogheimen Skoda, which is in fact Norwegian for that good shit, my brother. Check this riff. Doomy, depressive, melodic black metal greatness. One of the darkest pieces of music they ever wrote. And the follow-up riff ain't bad either. Check it out, they go full like Master's Hammer with this sort of stuttered rhythm guitar strum, which leads into yet another well-done doomy section that even managed to redeem one of the most onerous aspects of the earlier part of this single. They actually managed to make that horrible fucking noise work. Everything in moderation, I suppose. Here it actually sounds okay. It fits the more militaristic tone of this song, at least. Something about those keyboards and those more heavy metal sounding riffs actually gives me a pretty big Rotting Christ vibe. Probably the most Hellenic black metal sounding song on this Norwegian black metal split. But yeah, Dimmu Borgir way back in the day were actually a really sick band when they weren't making pointlessly long intros or hitting the button on their Casio. Up next in the category, I swear to God, this band used to be really amazing. We have Ancient, who I covered in depth on Radio Free Innsmouth episode 82 like 4 years ago, with their 1994 7-inch Det Glemte Riket. And you can see now why I thought that one part in that early Dimmu Borgir song sounded like something Ancient would do, because they use that kind of clean guitar riff all the time, as you're hearing right now. And when you only do it for a minute or so, it makes for a great intro to an absolutely fantastic black metal song. Later, Ancient is very much in the Cradle of Filth, gothy, vampiric sort of mode.
Incredible, smooth muscle control.
Their early shit, however, is totally a follow-up to Bathory in the best way possible, with very groove-laden, epic sort of riffage, and it's all very catchy. And it tends to utilize the bass a lot more frequently than what would be normal for sort of black metal stuff. Also, check out this counterpoint riff. That's good stuff right there. Incredibly catchy without becoming saccharine at all. Really good songwriting. Speaking of which, some more songwriting dynamics type stuff with a little bit of an interlude. based around their characteristic combination of wind noises and clean guitar done in a much more effective and succinct manner than Dimmu Borgir, I might add. If you've only ever heard later Ancient, you might be surprised to hear me describe them as a very subtle band, but at this point in their career they were. Like, the rhythm guitar playing on this is really layered and gradual in how it builds things up, and the smooth, dark, deep, and sort of fuzzy guitar tone they've taken is the perfect way to show off all of those details. Much like Immortal did before them, they do a really cool job at ending this song with sort of a blasting black metal kind of coda. Like I said, if you haven't heard early Ancient, you should probably check out episode 8, Torre Freds. But more than that, you should go out and get all their early stuff. Up through like the Trolltar EP is like flawless black metal. Incredibly underrated. And the Det Glimterike 7-inch included with the True Kings of Norway split is no exception to that. The final section of this compilation is perhaps the most surprising one because it's Arcturus, who actually didn't put an album out until 1996. But their 7-inch single is actually the oldest material on this release from 1991, back when they were sort of a weird offshoot of a death metal band called Mortem. And you would think, okay, maybe this is going to be some very death metal influenced black metal like Immortal. Not so. In fact, this single honestly doesn't sound like anything else I've ever heard. Arcturus, who I covered also about 4 years ago on episode 91, have always been a weird band, and this is probably their weirdest release. First song on the album has barely any guitar at all, mostly just like weird noises. The main instrumental voices coming through are the keyboards and the drums. Guitar's just kind of doing this weird wailing feedback. And honestly, out of everything released by the early Norwegian black metal scene, this might surprise you, but I think this single might actually be the scariest. It's definitely some real creepy stuff. I wonder if this is what Abruptum sounds like to people that actually enjoy Abruptum. I don't know. Definitely damn creepy sounding. This part sounds like it's got guest vocals coming from the fruit cellar. The B-side of this single, entitled Morax, is a little bit more conventionally metal sounding in that the guitar plays a larger role, but it's still incredibly strange. This like weird layered wall of noise, the almost krautrock, jazzy style drumming, and those, as always, creepy keyboard drones. I kind of wish Arcturus of this era had put out a full-length album, but I don't know if the world would have been ready for that level of...
Boom! Haunted house!
There is one sort of death metal riff that manages to wind its way into this release, which you're hearing right now, but I don't know, man. With that weird keyboard line under it, it's still pretty far from anything approaching conventional death metal. Definitely quite heavy. But wait until you hear how they come out of it. It wraps up that chromatic sequence and heads back into that doomier sort of sound from earlier, giving a greater degree of finality with this spooky fade out. But then it comes back in
By getting money at its back!
and the only guitar is this looped sample of when the guitar initially faded out. Everything else is just drums and this really haunting sort of keyboard line. Probably the only thing on this release that sounds a little bit like later Arcturus in that it has that same sort of evil circus vibe they were so fond of. Really harrowing stuff, and it's most easily available right here on the True Kings of Norway split, which is well worth picking up for collecting all of these great early Norwegian black metal 7-inches, and provides a really well done overview of kind of the lunatic fringe of the metal scene at the time. Hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about it. Even if you didn't, thanks for listening or watching, whatever the fuck you did, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
ガタゴトガタゴトガタゴトガタゴトって大変そうに見えますが